Hello, and thank you for joining us today for this webinar on Skills on the Move, Migrants in the Survey of Adult Skills. This topic is based on a recent publication produced by the Directorate for Education and Skills. The publication is available on the OECD iLibrary page. Andreas Schleicher, Director of Education and Skills at the OECD, is joining us today to talk about the report. We are also joined by Francesca Borgonovi and Michele Tuccio. Please feel free to send your questions at any time during the presentation to Eric Magnuson. The PowerPoint that Andreas is presenting, along with the publication, are available as handouts. Just click on Handout at the top of your screen to download the results. Now to you, Andreas.
Thanks so much and welcome. This is a really interesting report that we produced between our Directorates for Education and Employment, because when we talk about migration and migrants, it's often a story in the margins or in between the fields of education and employment. The media often portray migrants in crisis. We have got to associate them with poverty, with disadvantage, and by implication, often poor skills. But in fact, that's only half of the story. We've now actually got a comprehensive direct assessment of the skills of adults, including migrants. So we no longer need to rely on very often poor proxies for skills, such as degrees and qualifications that only tell us part of the story, that tell us something about the past of people, but not what they can currently actually do. And so we have a direct assessment of reading skills, of also numeric skills, obviously in the language in which people were tested. So in the host country, they may not reflect the literacy skills of the people in the country where they came from, but they are the relevant language for getting a job, for finding employment. So they are an important set of skills. And actually what we see from this is that migrants, while we do have a fair number or fair share of poorly skilled migrants, are a quite heterogeneous group. People with different aspirations, with different skills, with different contexts. And that is very important, because what it means to policy, that policies need to be tailored as well. They need to recognize the differences in the migrant population, the diversity in migrant populations. The first thing I want to show you is, in fact, that the share of migrants can vary very significantly across countries. They can account for up to 30% of the adult population, which is what you see on the right side of the chart in countries with a long migration history, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. They were, have a long migration history. And on the other hand, you look on the left side, there are some countries where the share of migrant is almost negligible. Korea and Japan are a good example, but others as well, or European countries. You can see on the left side a country like Lithuania with a very small share of migrants, and on the right side, a country like Sweden, where actually the migrant share is very significant. So the dimension looks very different across countries. The question in our report is, of course, what about their skills? The blue bar shows you the skills of foreign-born people, adults in the age group 16 to 65. The diamond shows you the skills of native-borns. This is about literacy, so scores on this test that we gave to adults. And what you can see in virtually every country, the exception is Chile, there's a gap. There's a gap in the literacy skills measured in the test language in the country where people are. So that's important to keep in mind. Migrants are less proficient in literacy, and the same would hold for numeracy and problem-solving skills that I don't show you here. But again, keep in mind, this is about the literacy skills in the language of the host country. We do not know how literate they are in their native language. We just know how literate they are in the language of the country in which they currently are. But in fact, that's important, because that is also the language in which they need to typically operate in the job they are, and so on. But again, you can see the skills of migrants vary greatly. And in fact, what you can see is sometimes the skills of native-borns are not as good, in some countries, are not as good as the skills of foreign-born people in other countries. So it's not just the relative size, it's also the absolute levels of skills of migrants that can be very different across countries. You look, for example, in a country like the Netherlands, there's a big gap between foreign-born and natives. In a country like New Zealand, the gap is very small, but when you look at the absolute levels of skills of native-borns, they are quite similar, whereas the absolute skills of foreign-borns seem to be very different. We also see from the data that migrants are more likely to have a very low level of literacy skills. When you look at the population that is quite poorly skilled, you can see an overrepresentation of people with an immigrant background. And again, that's not a surprise because we know that there is a share of people who come from very disadvantaged kind of circumstances. You just see that in the data. When you compare that with native-borns, that share tends to be a lot lower. What's more interesting is when you look at the high end of performance distribution, that's what you can see on this chart. The people who got to the most advanced levels of literacy, levels 4 and 5 on our test, you can see actually the picture is much more mixed. Now, yes, there are some countries in which that share of highly proficient people is much greater among native-borns, that's the white bar here, but yet there are other countries in which basically you can see that gap is much less pronounced. So among the highly skilled people, we don't see the same level of disparities that we see among the poorly skilled. There are actually, in many countries, a very large, significant share of immigrants with very highly skilled. And that tells us, again, that is precisely the story. Not all people with an immigrant background have low skills. Some are actually extremely highly qualified, and we sometimes forget them in the kind of image that is created by the media, driven by certain crises. Another thing that is very important, apart from levels of education, migrants are also quite diverse on many aspects. Here you can see the literacy proficiency of all foreign-borns, and then foreign-borns who are native speakers in the host country. So, for example, when someone from Chile goes to Spain, we would consider them in the diamond. Now, suppose variables are important, but what I wanted to really show is here how diverse the migrant profile really is in terms of the test scores. For example, what you can see, migrants who had acquired the highest qualification in the host country tend to have a higher level of literacy proficiency, actually 24 points, as you can see here, than migrants who had earned their highest qualification in another country. So there is an advantage for migrants who have earned their qualifications in the country where they were tested. You also see that migrants who arrived before the age of 6 in the country where we tested them have a much higher level of literacy proficiency, 27 points here, than migrants who arrived after the age of 6 years. That's perhaps not surprising because probably the people who arrived as very young children were sort of went through the same kind of learning opportunities to acquire the language of the host country. But again, it shows that we need quite different language policies if we want to actually upgrade the skills of people. There are also large differences in literacy proficiency related to the migrants' region of birth. What you can see is that migrants from EU countries typically have higher levels of skills than other migrants in the countries which we compared here. You can see that on the right side of the chart. The duration of their stay and the language which they speak, all of this also plays an important role in their skills. So basically, what is important is that the profile of migrants can be very, very different. And that means countries need a very tailor-made approach in terms of the skills, in terms of the training, in terms of the integration programs that they offer to those very different people. That's really one of the main messages. Again, I mentioned this already, education is typically very strongly associated with proficiency, and that remains true for migrants. You can see whatever the level of education, migrants have a lower proficiency than native-borns. Take a given level of education, for example, the people with very low levels of education on the left side, you can see migrants are overrepresented. That's what we mean by FB, foreign-born. migrants are overrepresented among those people who are below level 1. To give you a sense on this test for adult skills, level 1 is about the literacy skills that we expect from a 10-year-old child. So really quite basic. And when you go to the high end of the education levels, there you can see the gap is not as big, but also there, generally speaking, when you look at people with similar formal qualifications, migrants tend to have somewhat lower skills at the highest levels. But again, importantly is that low educated migrants are particularly at risk of having very low proficiency. Now, you can see here, a quarter of them do not even reach level 1 in literacy, showing us that actually this is, if you think about immigration, integration policy, language is really the key, because language provides access to economic capital, to social capital, to work. It's everything for people. Looking at the origin of migrants, you can see that in this chart, actually, in most countries, of course, the migrant gaps that we have just seen in terms of literacy proficiency and numeracy proficiency, they're always shaped by the composition of the migrant population. The country of origin of migrants does play an important role here. Generally, as you can see, among the countries for which we have data here, migrants from EU countries have somehow similar skills in their native borns. But even among EU countries, you can see enormous variation now. You have basically a large share of migrants from EU countries in Ireland, basically 70%. Most of them are English born. But on the other side, in the Netherlands, you have only 15% of EU migrants, telling us that actually the Netherlands has, in a way, a more challenging migrant population language-wise than Ireland has. So again, the context of countries can be very different. I already mentioned the age of arrival is making a difference. And you can also see here that the share of immigrants who arrived before the age of 6 can be very different. You can see in Lithuania and Greece, it's most of the people, but in Spain, Norway, Chile, it's just a very small share now. And in all countries, apart here from Israel, the share is quite steady between 7 and 20%. And again, you could see before that it does make a difference in terms of language proficiency, with people arriving before that age having a significant advantage now. So once again, language is a key differentiator. Gaps in literacy skills between migrants and natives are around the level of 25 points. And again, they get reduced to just 13 points if migrants are native speakers or speak as well as native speakers. We also know that language proximity between the migrant's mother tongue and the host country matters. How similar or different are those kinds of languages? And then, the penalty of the age of arrival. Here you can see the share of immigrants who speak the host country language. In Chile, it's virtually everyone. So most of the people who go to Chile come from another Spanish-speaking country. The same is true in Estonia and so on. But then you get to Singapore, that's just about 1/3 of the people now. And Norway, Finland, United States, Sweden, Denmark, all of those are countries where you can see actually the share of immigrants who speak the host country language is much more limited. And when you look at the literacy gaps between natives and migrants, you can see that reflected here in that chart. This slide here shows you the observed difference in literacy scores between adults who are native born and foreign born people, the blue bar, but also the difference between migrants and natives of similar ages, education and gender are taken into account. So basically what we've done here, we've adjusted for age, education and gender, things that we know make a difference. And you can see basically that the language gap is a lot smaller when comparing the gap between migrants and natives who are both native language speakers, of course, of the language of the test that we are considering here. When you look at when you adjust for age, education, gender, and language, that's now the black dot, you can see how this gap shrinks. So that's basically just in a nutshell the impact that context really makes in terms of the literacy proficiency of people. I mentioned already the language distance, the similarity and difference of a language which migrants come from and which they speak in the host country varies a lot. You can see a measure of the average language distance in the blue bar. You can see, for example, in Singapore, those languages tend to be very different from which people come, in Sweden as well, in Norway as well, whereas in Estonia and Chile, you can see that gap is really small. I'm also showing you the interquartile range, the variability in this. You can see, for example, in Spain, the language distance isn't that big. Most people come from similar, Spanish or Portuguese speaking countries, but the variability is very high. That is, it can be very, very different, can be very important mix in language differences. And as you could see before, the similarity of the host and source country do make a difference. Now, what about activities of migrants? Adult training is very important for migrants, as you can imagine. People who have not got the levels of education will need to find some way to upgrade their skills, more so than people often without an immigrant background. Differences in participation rates within countries are actually quite small. What you can see here is for the foreign-born in the bars and the native-born with the black dot, and in fact, where I make it gray, I don't even find a significant difference. But what's actually quite interesting, or was interesting for us, that actually rates of participation in lifelong learning, work-related or not, actually tend to be quite similar. No? You would, of course, wish they would be higher about migrants because the skill differences are more pronounced, but at least they are not sort of that different from those without an immigrant background. What's also interesting, when we asked the individuals, adults, why didn't they take part in training, we found that the reasons are quite similar between foreign-born and native-born people. No? People are too busy. It's a little bit more true for native-born people, a little less true for foreign-born people, but for both, that's the main barrier. Training is too expensive. Foreign-born tend to say this a little bit more often than people who are native-born, but again, it's clearly an important barrier for both. Family responsibilities, scheduling, no employer support. Some of those barriers are difficult to overcome. The integration of work and study is often not difficult to manage for individuals and employers. Issues around cost, however, employer support, schedule, are ones that we can address policy-wise, and that we should be addressing policy-wise, because the cost of not doing that level of training for the individual and for society is many times larger than the cost of the training itself. So some of these barriers are ones that we should be able to do something about it in terms of public policy. One of the things that we also see is that when we look at labor market outcomes, migrants typically earn less than natives. Across almost all of the countries that we see on this chart, you can see that migrants have sort of worse labor market outcomes than natives. In particular, they are often more unemployed or inactive, and even those employed tend to have lower returns to education. Now, that's what you can see on this chart here in terms of the earnings that native people have. Again, as you can see in the figure, foreign-born adults earn significantly less than their native-born peers. But also what's interesting is that some migrant groups are doing better than others. Across the participating countries, the hourly wage of natives is only 5% higher than that of migrants educated in the host country, while it is 16% higher than the hourly wage of migrants with foreign qualifications. So those things, the difference between the different dots here are quite important. Another perspective that's interesting is not, we have talked a lot about the skills that migrants have, but another question is, of course, how well do they use their skills? Because, of course, effectiveness and productivity at the workplace is not just about the skills you have, but also how intensively do you deploy those skills? How well does your job actually extract those skills? And basically what you can see here is when you look at The unadjusted gap, that's basically the skill use gap between foreign and native born adults, you can see that can be very significant in countries like Italy, Slovenia, Germany. But then when you start to adjust for some of the factors, age, gender, education, and so on, you can see it shrinks. And when we also take the occupation into account, actually that difference isn't that significant anymore. At least in most places it's shrunken to more than half of it. So that's important to take into account, that issues around skill use, the big gap in the intensity in which reading skills are used at work, is actually to a large part explained by the occupation that people have, the age, gender, and the other factors that we talked about before. I already mentioned that migrants and skilled occupations, now the importance of where your qualification is acquired. Now you can see clearly that migrants who were educated in the country in which we tested them had a much lower risk of being in a low-skilled occupation than migrants who got a foreign qualification. That doesn't necessarily mean that the foreign qualification is necessarily worth less. It can often mean that we just do not understand and recognize it in the host country. And that's, again, one of the big areas for policy intervention, to think how we can do better to actually recognize the true skills that migrants have, rather than judging them by some certificate that we may not understand properly. But you can see it does make a really big difference. And you compare that with natives, now the figures in the diamond are a lot lower than that. We've also looked at a couple of social outcomes, the health status. Now that's what people said about their own health, and that's sort of not so clear. The pattern in some countries is slightly higher and others slightly lower. Often the differences are not that significant. And the same is true when we looked at, variables like trust. You can see for most countries, levels of trust perceived were a little bit lower for migrants than they were for natives, but there are also a couple of countries where it turns the other way around, so the picture not that clear. And also here, that's perhaps not so much a surprise. A native has much better access to the kind of social structures, institutions in the country, which often are a good generator of a level of trust, and that is the case for migrants. But again, you can see it isn't the case for all countries. So that's a brief overview of this study, and with the main findings. Again, the main message really is, don't think about a certain type of skills among all of migrants. Think of these people as a very diverse group. A lot of them really have big challenges. Some of them are very highly skilled. Some of them are very successful in the work, and when it comes to addressing the challenges they face, we also need highly differentiated policies. And I'm very happy that I have also my colleague Francesca Borgonovi on the line. She is actually the mastermind of the analysis, and will be happy to respond to any questions that you have together. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions. One is, do you have examples of effective policies that help migrants integrate into the labour market in different countries?
Well, there's a whole range of policies and practice that you need to look at. One of the most effective levers is starting early on with building the right language skills. Now, obviously, the earlier we can address the challenges that migrants face, the better. Starting in early childhood education in school to build those kinds of foundations, even later in life, providing language skills, providing access to work. But I'll let also my colleagues speak. They might have some really good examples also for the adult population.
Yes, thank you very much, Andreas. Indeed, the OECD has recently worked a lot on what can we do for integration policies for migrants that they're already settled in destination countries. And one of the policies that we found most effective is indeed the recognition and assessment of foreign qualification. I think from the report, what we show is that indeed migrants that has been educated at destination, they fare better in the labor market, but we don't have to forget that most of the migrants are already in the country of destinations, and hence we need to address also their own problems. We need to distinguish between two types of recognitions. Certain professions are heavily regulated, while other professions are not formally regulated. What we find is that it's important for those professions that they are regulated that countries try to create one-stop shops where migrants can have all the information necessary to understand how they can get their qualification assessed. And also, it's important that countries can establish a certain right to assessment on the part of the migrant. Governments can make a long way towards reducing costs and timing of such formal recognitions. And also, they should link more partial recognitions to certain bridging education in case the recognition of the foreign qualification is not fully in the destination of countries. And also in terms of those professions that they are not formally recognized, it's important that countries have a certain type of informal assessment of the foreign qualification that can give the employer a certain type of signal of the actual skills of the migrants.
Andreas, do you have any other comments?
No.
We have another question. What does the category migrant educated in the host country cover?
It's basically all migrants that up to the point of testing received their highest level of education in the country in which they were tested. No.
Okay. And we have another one here. What are your views on the findings about trust? Should governments make more efforts to promote trust in the political system among migrants, and how can they do that?
Well, again, first of all, trust has actually a lot to do with the skills that people have. In fact, we found literacy and particularly numeric skills a very important predictor of the levels of trust. The skills give you access to the resources in a society. You understand the society, the mechanism, the news, all of that is basically mediated through language and skills. So that's a very, very important, enabling people to access societal resources. Some of these things are hard to manage when you look at the kind of social fabric and capital that is in a country that is, of course, governments have only so much influence, but providing people with the kind of tools to access the resources, making sure, for example, that also when it is about access to the labor market, access to institutions, that that we don't impose unnecessary barriers, making systems complex to navigate for foreigners, whether it's social systems or education systems. The more we can basically make services transparent and accessible, the more we are going to be building bridges for people who come from different cultures, different systems. But it's a difficult area. And what you could see from the data overall, the gap is not as big as one might imagine for the average migrants. Now, of course, there are also here, there are very important patterns.
Yeah, and in fact, if I can jump in and provide even more response to the question is really not about political trust, so trust in institutions, but rather trust in others. So it is a key component of social cohesion. And in fact, the main result is that there are no huge differences and that skills matter in the same way among migrants and among non-migrants. I think what we could do more about is actually facilitating contact between individuals and making sure that even though there is diversity in society as a result of migration, and therefore it may be difficult at the beginning to establish links of trust, there are ways in which we facilitate, for example, migrants' integration in volunteering activities, in activities that link them up with others within their community, so that in a sense the climate on the ground is facilitating rather than hindering trust. And once trust is established, it becomes even more, it becomes easier to actually trust others. So in a sense, lack of trust in each other is a vicious kind of circle. On the other hand, we should try to move the organization of our societies and of our encounters on the ground to make sure that there is a virtuous circle of trust generating more trust in others.
Thank you. We have another question. Given the data you have collected, would it be possible to use country-fixed effects to tentatively assess the impact of a country's policies?
Yeah, you know, that's a difficult question always, because we talk about the cumulative kind of set of policies that impact, and we only have one point in time where we see sort of a result. So I'm not so sure that any type of causal analysis would be that helpful. I think the best we can do is really observe different patterns across countries and to derive from that, you know, assumptions under which circumstances outcomes will be better. Sure, you can do those types of analysis, but I'm not sure, you know, that would be the most fruitful approach to this problem.
Thank you. We don't have any more questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andreas, and thank you to our participants for your interest in this topic and the OECD's work on education. If you would like to find out more about our study on the skills of migrants, you can find the publication on the OECD iLibrary under the name Skills on the Move, Migrants in the Survey of Adult Skills. This webinar has been recorded and will be made available on our YouTube page, Edu Skills OECD. Once again, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for hosting us, Rebecca.
Thank you.